Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sparring Partners. And today we're talking to a topic that I have been spending a lot of time thinking about it and writing about it, which is monetization. It's a topic that it's heavily debated and yet very difficult. And it's very difficult to be realistic and to talk about it in sort of how can I say in positive and yet realistic terms. And so this is what we're going to do today, because I have the honor and pleasure to talk to Udai Kanukolanu, who is the Chief Revenue Officer at Rakuten Symphony. And I think the reason why this is an interesting conversation is because Rakuten has clearly done a lot of things differently from other operators, and this continues to do so. And in a way that it's much more, I would say, creative. But being creative is not really good enough. You have to actually be good at it, and you have to be creative in a good way. So today we're going to learn about what is that, how did they get where they are, what is their approach to monetization, why is it different, and how we can learn from it. So Udai, welcome to Sparring Partners.
Thanks for the introduction, Monica. Great to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Yes, as I said, it's a pleasure. And I've been following what you do, but maybe you can start it by telling everybody who you are, how you got there, what you're doing at Rakuten Symphony, first of all.
Sure thing. Look, 2.5 decades in the industry now. I'm a telecom lifer. Started out with Motorola in R&D roles, and then moved to Ericsson for another decade, and then Dell, and now finally here with Rakuten Symphony. And look, I think the exciting part about Rakuten is, for me, it kind of, stands for all the things that the industry needs in terms of really the future state of where the networks need to get to, the future state of where the business models need to get to for the industry. So this is a really exciting place and time for me here at Rakuten Symphony.
And it's particularly interesting because your background, it's with the big established guys. So it's not just a startup from startup. So I guess you know both sides of the equation. So when you got to Rakuten, what did you find that it was different? What is that? What is different in the approach at Rakuten?
Look, I think Rakuten is fundamentally a technology company. It's not really a classic telecom company, and I've been used to telecoms my whole career. So I think there's a sea change in terms of how technology companies operate, and I think that to me was kind of one of the first things that hit me in terms of how they think about things, how they think about solutions are fundamentally different in terms of how things work on the traditional telecom side versus a classic technology company like Rakuten.
Yes. So, and the difference starts with the way you plan the network, how you rolled it out, how you run it, and how you monetize it. So maybe you can talk about what's the difference in the different approach there, all the way to monetization, which is what we're going to be talking mostly about today.
Absolutely. I think, look, we probably best start with the DNA of Rakuten, right? When we think about Rakuten, when they started back in 1997, they're fundamentally a technology company that looked at different industries to transform these industries leveraging technology. So they started out with retail, and then they moved on to finance, banking. There are now 70 plus businesses that Rakuten is involved in, but with the same fundamentals that they started with, which is really leveraging technology to be able to kind of disrupt those industries. And when we talk about that, right? So what is really so different with a technology company coming into an industry is really breaking that what I would say is the capability cost entanglement, right? So typically most businesses, as they start to grow and scale, tend to have to kind of tag on cost alongside, right? So they're never able to break that entanglement because they're predominantly, run on human resources, and the cost generally scales along with capability. when a company like Rakuten comes into an industry, they bring technology. And the way they were able to kind of break that entanglement is really starting to kind of look at how machines operate the business versus humans operating the business. And that's kind of where they gain the cost advantage. And as they scale, their costs don't tend to kind of keep up. So the costs tend to flatten out and the capability and the services they bring to the market, continue to kind of grow. So that's kind of how they start to kind of disrupt the industry they get into, right? So, and that's been the DNA of Rakuten all the time from when they started back in 1997 to now. Now, obviously, the latest move has been into mobile, and then we'll talk a little bit more as we progress into this conversation in terms of how we looked at mobile and how we brought our technology DNA to mobile, the choices we had to make, and how that's progressed to kind of where we are today with Rakuten Mobile.
Yeah, and I guess it's actually not, you're not an isolated case in a way, because, when you think about all the innovation, say, in handsets came from Apple and Google, who did not know, I mean, they were not part of the industry. So sometimes disruption that comes from outside is better because your DNA is different. And that, just from the beginning, and I guess you got a lot of questions, I mean, throughout your existence, why are you doing this, why are you doing that? It's different from everybody else. And so that was a difference. And so, and the way you think about the network and your subscribers, and we're going to get more into that. So why don't we go a little bit more into from this huge company that has diversified businesses into mobile? How did that go?
Look, I think our founder, Hiroshi Mikitani-san, right? So he's a visionary when it comes to kind of how he thinks about industries and the challenges. And as he built this ecosystem, he was convinced that mobility was going to be that connectivity fabric across his ecosystem. So his thought process of coming into connectivity was a little bit different, right? For him, it was really amplifying the ecosystem that he'd built. So that was the thesis in terms of why Rakuten looked at mobility as the next industry to get into. And when Rakuten first started its journey into mobility, obviously considering their DNA and where they're coming from, and when they look at the landscape, they didn't really find anything that fit their technology DNA. And by that I mean, Rakuten owns its system design, right? And they look for partners that work within that design, because at the end of the day, that's the secret sauce. That's something that they don't want to give up. And if you look at kind of a traditional, telecom industry, the OEMs, your network equipment providers own the system design, and generally you're force fitting your business into kind of their design. So it's a little bit opposite in terms of how Rakuten looks at their entry into telecom versus what the landscape looked like. So, them looking at the traditional options that had available to them just never fit within, the framework of how they envisioned the business. So, they were adamant in then coming into it with their own model, which is saying, here's kind of what my system design looks like. And then what are the parts pieces within this industry that fit within this system design? So that was the fundamental difference in terms of just even the starting point of how Rakuten looked at mobility. And then when you kind of start to look at what did those choices lead to, so when you own your system design, you kind of dictate what this looks like, right? So you can absolutely simplify it to the bare minimum. You can eliminate a lot of kind of the the add-ons and things that are not as necessary for your for your technology that you're looking to bring to the table, right? So if you look at how the traditional industry is, and I come from that side of the house, we're really great at building technology and scaling it globally. Where we struggle is really being able to kind of customize it, and that's just the model in which the traditional industry has been built. So for Rakuten, they had to kind of flip that on the head, right? So they're coming in saying, okay, now here's what I need. You bring the parts pieces that fit into this, right? So that's kind of where some of the choices were in terms of how the network was envisioned. And I think if you kind of look at the history of Rakuten and Rakuten Mobile as well, I think if you look at kind of the RFPs and the way they evaluated the options, it was less about technology, but more about the mindset of the companies they wanted to work with. They wanted to make sure they were working with companies that had a similar mindset, that were willing to work with them to be able to kind of build what they envision, right? So that's a very fundamental change in terms of how you build a network versus how traditionally networks are built.
Yeah, and I guess that, when you think about a lot of networks, they've been there for quite some time. And at the beginning, all the networks were the same because you didn't have that much choice. So you just keep going, and then you have a network, and you have to sell services to pay for the network and to become profitable. From your point of view, I guess it's just quite the other, as you say, it's the other way around. You have services that you want to sell, you have customers. What is the best network that would support that? So the monetization comes in from the other end of the universe in which you operate, right? Is that
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, I mean, you kind of bring up a very interesting point as well, Monica, right? When you said, when we look at the industry, a lot of the innovation comes from outside the industry, right? You talked about how, Google and Apples of the world are bringing in, innovation into the industry versus the industry itself really being able to kind of create any kind of innovation. And I think it kind of goes back to kind of some of the history we've had, right? And this kind of comes back to monetization as well. Because if you kind of rewind, a couple of decades, 3 decades back, we had services like messaging, voice that were really kind of built into the network. Nobody else could provide a voice service or a messaging service. So there was no competition. So when you look at how this industry has evolved, a lot of the dollars went into capex, right? So the R&D, the investment that is required to really innovate, moved into then the network equipment provider side of the house because the operators were focused on capex and being able to kind of build networks. That was really kind of what their essence was, because the services were given, right? If you built a network, you had the revenue on voice, on messaging. Now, as you kind of fast forward a decade in, all of a sudden, with the explosion of internet and services then being built on internet, the operators are now just stuck with connectivity because now voice is over the top, messaging is over the top, and all of the other services are over the top, while they continue to have to build and hold on, to the networks, put in the investment into the networks because data is exploding, so they got to keep up with that. They don't have any dollars left for R&D because all of those dollars are sitting on the NEP side of the house. Now, there's an interesting data point that I think STL Partners ran, right? So telcos generally tend to spend about less than 5% of their top line on R&D, while technology companies are spending 25% of their top line on technology. So it's only natural where innovation is going to come from, right? It's not really that difficult if you really start to kind of look at the nuts and bolts of the situation. Is you're going to get innovation. It doesn't come for free, right? You have to be able to invest and spend. And the investment is coming from the technology side into R&D, and that's where the innovation is going to come from. And telcos are struggling to break away from that. So the only way you're going to break away from that is really being able to kind of address your cost situation with CapEx. How do I get creative? How do I simplify my networks? How do I really move more of those dollars back into R&D where I can now actually start to spend on innovating? I can really start to kind of build on services. So these are some of the key tenets in terms of things that have to happen in the industry if we have to see more innovation. And that's kind of where fundamentally, like, when Rakuten comes into it, we look at that network and we say, what, how do we build it based on our system design? Because we have to be able to take those dollars to continue to innovate. Because without that, we're not here just to build a network and let, rest of the services play on top, right?
absolutely? And as I said, there are two ways in which you went. One was to simplify the network so it's easier. I mean, it's cheaper, easier. You kind of eliminate unnecessary parts, to say that. And on the other hand, is to think about services in a different way. So we need to talk about both. Where do you want to start?
Let's start about how we could have, I mean, maybe kind of we take off from where we left in the previous conversation, right? So when we look at the network, back to the point you're bringing up in terms of how did we envision, what are the fundamental principles for us to kind of build our network? It's around For me, four different things, right? So one is simplification. We don't want anything in our network that is not necessary. And you can think about and you can look at all of the networks there, the traditional legacy networks, and how much of legacy, not needed stuff sits in those networks, right? So the barely used stuff still sits in those networks. We are ruthless when it comes to simplifying our network. If you look at kind of our cell site versus a traditional legacy cell site, it's just, the proof is there, right? The amount of equipment that goes into kind of our cell site versus what a traditional cell site looks like, it's night and day, right? So simplification to the absolute nuts and bolts that are necessary and critical for our infrastructure is all that we see, right? So that's one. Two, duplication, right? So we absolutely eliminate any and all duplication because you can see that through, right? As you start to kind of build legacy, there are tons of processes that sit there that are constantly duplicated, right? So we come at it from that angle as well, right? So simplification and duplication are the two things that we look at to eliminate immediately. That's basic cost efficiencies. Then we need a network that is programmable, right? Because every layer of our network has to be programmable. That's a very fundamental tenet for a technology company. And then when you have that, then you're relentlessly automating. Every part and every aspect of what can be automated is automated. So when you're going to put these four things together in terms of how we want to build a network, starting with simplification, eliminating duplication, making everything programmable, and being able to kind of relentlessly automate, you then start to see why this network is significantly different in terms of economics. So the network that we've now built in Japan, it has over 300,000 radiating cells, right? It's serving 8.2 million subscribers now in Japan. It's a pretty mature network. And we've had third parties come in and do an assessment in terms of what the economics look like. And we're 40% cheaper on CapEx per cell site. And it's just visible to you. When you go look at a cell site in Japan that is ours versus the legacy, you can see it. I mean, if you come to our offices in Tokyo, we actually show it to our customers what our cell site looks like versus the competition, right? The amount of equipment that goes in is significantly lower. So you can imagine, right, the civil works that go into building a site, all of those aspects are significantly cheaper for us because there's only minimal equipment that goes there because of how we come about this design. Then you look at the OpEx side of the equation, we're 30% more efficient. I mean, cheaper than typical legacy operators that are running their networks. Today, we have 250 people that sit in our offices in Tokyo that run the entire network. Think about that for a second, right? Think about how many people you need to operate a traditional network. And we've capped it at 250 because we have a fundamental motto of just saying, if you need more people to do it, figure out how you're going to do it with machines. That is the tenet. So if there is something you need more people, figure out how you're going to automate it, how you're going to program it. We're not going to be adding people. We're going to basically cap it at 250 and everything else that's needed will be automated, right? So that's a very fundamental change in terms of how we look at it. So when you start to kind of look at what we've built from a technology choice to what we now have and what we've actually proven, right? This is not slideware and paperwork and thesis. This is reality now, right? So 40% lower CapEx and 30% lower OpEx to me is just, very meaningful numbers in terms of the technology choices we made and how we built our network.
Yeah, so we're gonna get to the revenue part, but before we get there, that sounds all very impressive, but how does it apply to somebody who's already operating a network where legacy is there? They have to support legacy, even though they don't like it. Can't just throw it away. So how does your model apply to pretty much everybody out there?
Look, I think the end game is the same for everyone. I don't think it's a choice, right? Now it's a choice of when you start when it comes to transformation, right? You can continue to kind of kick the ball down or you kind of start. And like I said, I mean, me and Jeff have this conversation and one thing that sticks with me is, this is just one thing he says, right? The best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago. The second best time is today, right? So that's the fundamental problem is if you don't get started, you don't get moving on these things. And I think when I talk to, and their operators are across the spectrum, right? There are some that are already running full speed ahead in terms of transforming their networks. They understand they have legacy, but they have to start somewhere. And then you're going to have to start to retire legacy as well, right? So this is the motion that everybody is going to be on. It is inevitable, right? We're not going to hold on to 2G forever, but you have to start somewhere. You have to transform, and you have to kind of start to move along this path. And this, to me, this is an inevitability. It's about when do you wake up and when do you start moving, right? So, and the operators are across the spectrum in terms of where and how they're, progressing on the transformation. So, but the path is clear. The blueprint exists. It's not, an experimental technology anymore. Because yes, I mean, if you were having this conversation, I'd say, 3 to 5 years ago, still technology wasn't proven, right? Does it still have the same performance and efficiency as, legacy technologies? That was a very, important question to answer. But I think we've answered that now, right? So we actually have a mature network. If you look at kind of the third parties and the assessment of our performance, of our network performance, we are better. I mean, we're as good, if not better, than the traditional technologies in our market, right? And they've compared, we have the fastest 5G speeds, for example, in Japan. So it's not just that, okay, they've got a great technology, it still has to be proven. The technology is proven, the blueprint of how to get there exists. Now it's about getting off the block and starting transformation. And I think there are several operators that have started and are well ahead. And there are still operators that are waiting to kind of see how this happens.
And I guess you're right. I mean, the technology is not a limiting factor here. It's really more like strategy, culture, business models, the kind of like soft
Yeah, yeah. I mean, absolutely,
aspect
right?
of the business.
So technology is one, to your point, the business transformation, people transformation. So by no means is this an easy transformation, but it is a necessity, right? I think that's, the gap between, operators that transform and operators that don't is going to start to significantly become more and more, right? Just because of kind of the advantages you get with the newer technologies in terms of what you can do, not just from a classic economic perspective from the bottom line, but also from the innovation and the top line that you can generate with the service innovation that you can bring to the table.
Yeah. Well, change, I mean, to be honest, is often to some extent painful. It might be exciting, but there is also some level of pain, discomfort. So, you can have some sympathy
Well,
there
absolutely.
because that is, it's work.
Absolutely, right. And I think that's kind of where, when I work with operators, it's about trying to find a starting point, right? We cannot kind of boil the ocean. We're going to have to find areas where we start with. And I think this is, to your point, a very slow, deliberate transformation, because it is a very complex transformation, right? There's no kidding about that. But it's really being able to kind of find that right starting point. And different operators have different areas where they want to start. And that's fine, right? Some of them would start with, virtualization, cloudification. Some may start on the operational side of things with how they transform, how they build networks, how they manage networks, how they orchestrate their network. So there are different starting points for this evolution. It's about finding the sweet spot and really starting that journey. And that's kind of really where, when we get to the market and when we're talking to operators, it's really kind of trying to find that starting point.
Mhm. Absolutely. So on one hand, when you think about monetization, it's basically profitability. That's the whole goal. It's not so much to maximize revenues, it's to maximize profitability. So on one hand, you can be more efficient on the cost side, but what do we do on the revenue side? The services. Which
Absolutely.
is the area that in a way maybe operators feel less in control. They are less in control, feel less in control and less sure about what to go. They've tried, or they think they've tried a lot of things and nothing really worked quite well. So how you stand on that side of
I
the
mean, I
equation?
think that to me is where, Rakuten can bring the biggest value to this ecosystem. Because when we look at our business, right? I mean, and this is not unique to Rakuten, we look at two key factors. One is the lifetime value of our subscribers, and two is the cost of acquisition. If you're going to look at those two factors and see how you can optimize both of those vectors, you're going to end up with really creating value. That's how we look at our business, whether it is, like I said, e-commerce or insurance, it doesn't matter. For us, we don't even call them subscribers, so they're members for us, right? That's how we look at it. Their customer experience is really critical for us. So when we look at these two vectors, which is, the lifetime value, how do I maximize the lifetime value of our members? And then how do I minimize the cost of acquisition of members? We've come up with some fundamentals of what's required, and we call this the platform play, right? So as long as the platform, is solid, these tend to kind of optimize themselves. And when I talk about platform, right, there are four key tenets there. One, of course, is the brand, the trust factor. When you have the right brand and when you have the right trust in the market, which generally the telcos tend to have, right? I mean, irrespective of what market you go to, they're generally well known and pretty well trusted. So you, as a telco, generally tend to kind of check that box already, right? And so one is brand. Then the other part is what we call as the one ID, right? When you come into us, we create your ID and we have to make it easy for you to transact business. And that's a very fundamental tenet. It shouldn't be to where, for example, when we have a member come into our ecosystem, their ID is something that they're able to leverage across the ecosystem. We make it extremely easy for them to transact once they are in the ecosystem. So that encourages them to kind of stay in the ecosystem, which is basically, addressing our cost of acquisition. We don't have to go chase them again. They're already in it. So we have to really make transactions very, very easy. Third thing is what we call as the points. And this to me is the Rakuten secret sauce. There's a lot of complexity in terms of what goes in to the point system and how we create. And that's the secret sauce at the end of the day. But as a concept, if you can think about it, and I think this is something that a lot of them miss. We all travel in this industry, right? And we all are attached to some kind of point system, right? Whether it is One World or whether it is Star Alliance. If we can, realize how much of our decision making is tied to our point system, and think about how hard you have to think through to kind of actually pick a flight that's not in your point system, because points become, mentally, that's something you want to stick with because there's value you can attach to point and membership. So that's something we generate in our ecosystem with our point system. And the points are really valuable, right? So you're able to kind of use these points not just with an ecosystem, but also with third-party partners we build relationship with. So those points become extremely powerful. And when you build the right point system, you have extreme stickiness. People just transact within the ecosystem because those points are so valuable to them. Discounting versus points, this is something that I think the industry in general has gotten it wrong. I see a lot of programs, we say we find discounts, it's 50% less or 5% less. But having a point system is a very different concept and a very different approach to this. And that to me has generated significant more stickiness to the Rakuten ecosystem. And for us, the numbers are, the proof is in the pudding, right? So we see it. And for us, that's the other secret sauce when we talk about the platform. And then the latest tenet of our platform. So, right, we've talked about brand, we've talked about member ID, we've talked about points. The latest tenet is data. Now it's about, we're generating so much data in our ecosystem. We know so much about our members in terms of where they're buying, what the patterns are. There's so much data that's generated. And the biggest entrant with mobility into our ecosystem, our data is so much more richer in terms of the insights we drive from it. So when you now start to kind of look at data and then how we're now building all of these machine learning pipelines and all of the, we're bringing intelligence into our data and the insights we're driving from them to kind of then augment our business, that's really kind of where things are getting really amplified in our ecosystem. And when you kind of start to look at those four as the tenets of the platform, you can start to see how any business we build on top is just almost like a service we build. And it is almost inevitable for it to be successful because we have a significant advantage walking in. Because one, our cost of acquisition is much lower because we already have the members in the system that will be leveraging the new services we build. There's a point system that makes it extremely sticky. And we know exactly where and what they're wanting from the data that we have. Right? So we have a significant advantage when we come into no matter what service we come in. Right? So when we think about monetization and how do you monetize, that's the Rakuten secret sauce in terms of how we build 70 plus businesses and how we're continuously successful year over year in growing businesses across the ecosystem. So let me pause there to kind of see if you have any thoughts or questions.
Yeah, so this is very fascinating again because you're able to expand with the services. In fact, the network allows you to offer better services. So it's the other way around. But if I were to, present the perspective of your traditional mobile operator, where they're operating in an environment where someone like, if you're an Android person, you have Google that has all the information about you already, and they're using it to their advantage. They have, reasonable brand, and you have your own point systems attached to a few. How can a mobile operator come in and basically build an alternative to that and be successful? So they've been trying a little bit, but never really succeeding in the way that you did because you already kind of had it.
I think,
So
look, it's understanding the customer promise in your region. Because I mean, the customer promise is different, right? I mean, Japan has a different set of priorities. Step one is really understanding what I would call as your customer promise for your region, for your market. And then, building it, it's not about just building independent services. I think that's kind of where we kind of lose the play a little bit. Is okay, you know what, you build a payment system or you build a finance or you have some independent set of things. But I think the secret sauce is really building that platform play. And I think that's really what Rakuten can bring to operators that are on this journey, is we're now starting to kind of, package our technologies to be able to kind of really help the ecosystem and kind of, at the end of the day, I think the promised land is the same. Operators want to be more technology companies, want to be able to offer more services. And from the other side, where we come from services, we're building mobility to kind of really amplify our services. So I think the meeting point is the same. And what us as Rakuten can bring to the table is really our platform play, our learnings of how we built the ecosystem, of our learnings of the four tenets that I talked about, and really be able to kind of enable operators globally in terms of really understanding their customer promise and being able to kind of build that ecosystem ground up with the right platform play. So you're able to kind of create that stickiness with the right set of whether it's a point system or what have you that we've talked about, creating that data layer in terms of really, understanding, collecting, and driving insights from that data layer, and being able to kind of then maximize that for the services you're going to be creating. So I think it's a very integrated play in terms of how to kind of go through this. And there are some very fundamental tenets that need to be put together, which is where kind of Rakuten can bring to the ecosystem to kind of support them through this journey.
okay, so clearly you need to navigate with your customers different situations in different countries, regulations, concerns about privacy and security, safety are all very different. There's a huge amount of differences. How do you navigate that in terms of making sure that you both comply with the regulations and also that your subscribers or members are comfortable with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, there's an interesting approach you've taken with mobility, right? So we actually offer a free service for a certain set of consent. So there's a way around it in terms of how because for us, data is significantly more valuable than probably a little bit what we get on an ARPU basis for voice, right? So there are trade-offs to your point, right? Obviously, the regulations are regulations, and you stick with that, and that varies by region, and you got to adhere to those. But when it comes to the consent part of things, there are ways to kind of be able to kind of entice a member to kind of be able to kind of provide additional consent for us, for certain services that we're getting, right? So we've kind of managed to do that in a good way within our ecosystem to where we now have more access to kind of their whether call it their spending or where they're going. So we have more intelligence because of the consent we have from our members, and in return they do get a free voice service as a good example, right? So there are ways to kind of even think through that specific problem. Regulations being regulations, but how can we kind of really get ahead in terms of the type of data that we require for us to be able to kind of really enhance and amplify the ecosystem we're bringing to our members.
Absolutely. So, well, okay, good. Now, another topic that I'm sure you got this question asked all the time. How is AI play into all this? Because, but from an internal point of view, in terms of improving your ability to run the network and offer services and manage services, and also from the user perspective.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, you can't escape this at this point, right? Either you adopt or you're going to be left behind. We've talked about machines and humans and how businesses, you know, you know, get impacted with this. We're now to a stage where machines don't just, perform actions; they're able to take decisions. That's a massive shift in terms of capability for machines that we're seeing over the last few years, right? So this is now, if we don't latch on to this, then we're just going to get left behind. So for us, it's about AI has been in our DNA, not now, but since the inception, right? So it is all the way from Mickey on down. All right. So every single decision, every single choice we make is through the AI lens. Is this something we can leverage AI for? So it's not just on the network side of things, right? Every part of our business. I mean, our calls, our sales leads. It doesn't matter what part of the business or the organization we're talking about. We first start to think from an AI lens. Is there a way to leverage AI? Is there a way to kind of make this better through AI, right? So to me, it's an inevitability, and I think this is going to become a massive differentiation in terms of, and it's going to be very clear quickly. You look at, and the basic nuts and bolts of operations and customer management and all of these things where AI is going to play a massive role, right? That's a given. But to me, it's fundamentally changing your business. You're fundamentally changing business to kind of machine operated versus human operated, and be able to kind of leverage this additional capability now we get with machines where they're now actually able to take decisions. So now it's about starting to slowly release control, right? So when we look at our network and autonomous networks, we got to get there faster. How do we kind of start to trust the machines and machines making decisions? Today, machines make majority of the decisions for us, but we still have good amount of human oversight. Now it's about starting to kind of reduce that and continue to kind of progress towards that autonomous networks. So I mean, to me, AI plays a very critical role through that progression in terms of where networks are today, where they need to be tomorrow.
Yeah, and as I say, it's just going to be pervasive, whether you like it or not. In a sense, it's like it's not, unavoidable. But the sort of giving up control, that's culturally hard, and actually realistically hard, because probably whatever model you introduce today is not perfect, so you need to go to a point where you can trust it to the point that you give up control. How are you going about that?
So look, I think it has to start with the introduction, right? So we have to kind of put that into the network. I mean, today, if you look at kind of the number of alarms that are generated, managed, and how much human interaction we have, and going back to the point of saying, you know what, you cap your resources on the operation side to 250, and figure out how you're going to do it with machines, right? As a fundamental tenet. If you look at the amount of automation we already have in the network, it already exists. Now we have minimal oversight. We know where the gaps are. We know where the tuning needs to be, because we already have that in the system. And as you rightly said, as we progress through these things mature, and you start to kind of have the trust that you're doing the right things within the network to be able to kind of slowly, release that control and progress more towards a autonomous network. So that's the progression we're in, but it starts with having the technology. You have to kind of build that technology into your networks. You have to kind of understand the progression, and then go down this path of kind of releasing control more towards the autonomous networks.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think that again, this is sort of part of the change and the transformation. It's just going to be sort of part of it. You need to become comfortable with it, but the only way to do it is to start. Otherwise, you never will be. You're never going to wait to the point where everything is set, and then you just you take it off the shelf. And I guess that when you look at change, one thing that I forgot to ask you about is the issue of disaggregation. Because on one hand, you want to reduce the duplication and unnecessary complexity of your network, but at the same time, you have been spearheading this approach to disaggregation, which to some extent brings in some complexity, because if you have multiple vendors, well, you have more complexity because they need to work with each other. So how important is it, and how can you make sure that disaggregation doesn't bring in so much complexity that it voids all the advantages of the other simplification you're doing?
I think this has been the critical challenge in the industry when it comes to transformation. If you look at the next generation networks in terms of the number of components that go into it, the number of applications that are sitting on it, the number of layers of the network, it is complex, right? And operators traditionally are not comfortable being their own system integrator. They need these parts coming more integrated. And that's, I think, been the biggest challenge in trying to kind of move away from the legacy options to the next generation options. Now, one way the ecosystem can support itself is really start to kind of do this, the pre-integration, as I would call it, right? So there, and there's a lot of effort within the ecosystem to do that, right? If we look at kind of our technologies and the number of IoTs we're starting to do, right? Because we bring the software, we need the hardware, whether it is kind of on the server side of things or whether it is on the radio side of things. There's a constant progression in terms of expanding that ecosystem, in terms of being able to kind of interop with more. And I think this has got to be a mindset in the ecosystem. If we are to kind of succeed as an ecosystem, it is important that we are playing with each other and playing well. And to me, this is going to be the biggest hurdle in getting past. And there's still a lot of resistance. I see that in the ecosystem. We're still very guarded in terms of who we want to play with and who we don't play with. But we're going to have to get past this, because there's no way to solve the disaggregation challenge and the pain points for the operators if the ecosystem doesn't come together to be able to kind of really play well with each other, to kind of have pre-integrated solutions that the operator can comfortably start to kind of take into their labs and their validations and into their networks. So I think it's in a formative stage, and you kind of rightly call out that is the biggest challenge in the ecosystem today, is how all of these parts and pieces come together and they play well. Today, it's very limited, and I really want to see that accelerate in the ecosystem. I think there's got to be more trust within the players in the ecosystem, because we do compete, and we also have to be able to play well with each other. It's a very interesting dynamic that you see in the ecosystem, right? So you're competing with your partners on one end, but you also have to play with them on the other side to succeed. So it's a very frenemish kind of a situation in the ecosystem, but as we progress through it, as we see more of these deployments and more of these installations, I think it becomes a forcing factor as well within the ecosystem to kind of get there.
So what do you think is going to be the driver? What is it going to push things to move forward faster? Because a lot of operators are kind of waiting for it to happen before they go and change. But then obviously there's all the sort of legacy vendors that are obviously tied to less disaggregated, more vertically integrated solution, because that's what they've always been doing. They feel comfortable and they get more profits from.
Absolutely.
You
I think
know,
it's going to come to a tipping point soon, right? I mean, if you look at kind of where things were even a few years ago to where things are now, I mean, you've got major tier ones now already announcing and progressing down the path of disaggregation, right? So it's not a concept anymore, it's reality. Now, are 100% of their networks transformed? Not yet. But what you are starting to see are the bigger tier ones, whether it is in the Americas or in Europe or in Asia Pacific, you're starting to kind of see the movement, and that's really the fuel that this ecosystem needs, right? So the operators are not really sitting on the fence anymore. They are moving in a controlled manner, of course. That's just the nature of the industry we're in. They are allocating 15, 20, 30% of their networks for the disaggregated. So once you start to do that, you automatically start to, one, get comfortable with the technologies, two, see the advantages of the technologies, and then you can start to quickly see where that 20, 30% becomes 50, and that 50 becomes 70 before it becomes 100%. So I do feel we're now past that inertia that we had over the last several years. There are several operators that announced in 2024 to kind of move into disaggregation, and I see the pipeline of several more coming in 2025 as well. So I think we're past that now.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, we're past the concept of just open RAN or opening just a part of the network. It's just disaggregating the whole thing, opening it up, making it more flexible. which, again, increases complexity in the short term, but eventually, once you get used to it, well, hopefully it's not going to be the pain factor is going to go slow down. Now, one thing you said, we've been talking now for quite some time about monetization and all the attending factors, and interestingly enough, you never mention ARPUs at all, which is usually where the whole discussion starts and ends. It's the ARPU, because that's seen, that is the thing. So why didn't you mention ARPU? Why is ARPU's not been part of our discussion today?
Because for us, we look at it as lifetime values. We don't really are not tied to ARPU as much. ARPU is one part from a network. For us, network is significantly more valuable than specifically what we get on that network. We look at the amplification across the ecosystem. We talk about lifetime value of our members. And that's really how we think about the business. It's a much broader concept than specifically trying to figure out how you get that extra $3 or $4 out of the subscriber and how you kind of bump your ARPU. If anything, we take it the other way. When we came into the market, we came in with price plans that were significantly cheaper that have now made the entire, the ecosystem come down in terms of pricing, right? So for us, it's less about ARPU, it's more about the lifetime value of our members. And that's really how we look at mobility, right? It is important, of course, from an ARPU perspective, but that's a smaller factor in terms of how we look at the overall impact of mobility on our business. So it's a little bit different in terms of how, traditionally operators think about revenue versus, how we look at revenue.
So when you said the lifetime value, can you give us a little bit more of a sense of what goes into there? How do you compute it? How do you evaluate it?
And but lifetime value is pretty simple, right? How much we bring in a member, we want to see how we maximize what they spend with us. Now, a very interesting data point we have is since the introduction of mobility into our ecosystem, we see that each of the members that have, for example, mobility tend to use 2.53 on average more services in our ecosystem than the non-mobility user is. So to me, that's a very fantastic data point, right? When you think about it, we've talked about how mobility and ecosystem, how they play together. There's been a lot of concepts and thesis around it. We have a fantastic data point in our system, right? When you have a mobile user, they tend to use more of your services. That's a very basic thing, right? So when you think about lifetime value, that subscriber, that member that is in our network with mobility has easier access to all of the other services and tends to be spending more in our services as opposed to going out. And we've also built the technology a little bit that way. We have what we call as Link, which is a super app, which makes it so the customer experience with our mobility is very different, right? So they come into Link, they're messaging there, they have all of the different services there, they have all of our ecosystem available. It's right at their fingertips. For example, a subscriber wants to make travel plans. It is so much more easier to use Rakuten Travel than trying to kind of go to Expedia or something else because it's right there at their fingertips. And by the way, they get points when they use it. So the access part, so we see that as a real clear data point when we look at a mobility member versus a non-mobility member, right? So that kind of to me is very fundamental in terms of how this is playing out.
Yeah, and I guess it's actually, you talk, when you talk about customer experience, it's like the customer experience or what your members are doing. But oftentimes when we talk about user experience, it's like the 5G user experience, sort of like, what is the latency? What is the throughput? And clearly these are, crucial measures, don't get me wrong. But from the person using it's just not something or care. Is it work? Is whatever I'm trying to do working or not? Whatever that is.
The way to think about it is our industry or the device we use, it started out as a connectivity device. So it was really important that the connectivity was measured, was solid. Now connectivity is a table stake. You cannot have a mobility service without coverage, without latency, without the performance factors. And that's a given. So we almost consider that a table stake. Without that, you're not doing anything beyond that, right? But we do look at that mobile device as significantly more than just a connectivity device. It's an entertainment device. it's an e-commerce device, it's all of these other things that are more important to us, which are built on the bedrock of connectivity. So it is a table stake. By no means are we saying it's not critical or important. Again, that's why there's focus on making sure we have the best network in the country. That's a table stake. I mean, you cannot get away from it. But then it doesn't stop there. We cannot stop at the connectivity layer. It's about then what you build and what you leverage from that connectivity. That to me is the more interesting part for us.
Yeah. Is it, let me ask the sort of devil's advocate question here, but as a member, could you feel like you're a little bit in a walled garden in a sense that, okay, everything is nice and convenient, but I do not have a choice. So if I want to book travel with Expedia or whatever, it's just more complicated. Or I guess it's just as complicated as it is for everybody else, right?
Exactly. Right. I mean, it is as complicated as it is for everybody else, right? It's not like they can go outside the ecosystem. There's no restriction around what they use, but we make it significantly more attractive and simpler for them to consume services within the ecosystem. And that's kind of where the stickiness comes from. That's where the ease of use comes from. And it's really kind of driving that behavior into our ecosystem.
Okay, now we've talked about your members, but what about the enterprise? So enterprise services or services to other app developers or service providers. How do you think about that?
So we don't look at it any different. For us, an enterprise is no different than another member for us, right? It's the same kind of approach we have in terms of how we entice enterprise, how we ensure that, they get the same type of experience. So we really don't differentiate, enterprise to members for us. It's a very similar mindset in terms of how we service, in terms of, now again, there are certain criteria that is more important to enterprise and that we understand and we cater to it. But fundamentally, there is really not a whole lot of difference in terms of how we look at the business models. For us, members are members, and some of them could be enterprises in terms of what they're leveraging from our ecosystem. It's really the same approach. It's really the same tenants. It's really the same platform in terms of how we think about attracting and keeping enterprises within the ecosystem as well.
Absolutely. So now let's try to see what's happening next. So different areas like sensing, satellite, low altitude. Well, eventually we'll have 6G, but we don't need to go into that if we can. So what's changing? What's coming up in terms of monetization?
So in terms of a couple of things I wanted to touch on through this, right? Of course, in terms of next steps, we are looking at satellite just as probably every operator is. For us, it's a significantly smarter way of getting coverage in areas we don't. There are parts of Japan that we can't reach. Significantly more easier to do that through satellite. We have a partnership with AST today. We're also exploring other options. But that's definitely a technology that makes sense for us to leverage, and we're full on into kind of assessing that and launching some of that into our network. So I think that's a given. But in terms of what's next for us from a Rakuten perspective, right? So and more now specifically from Symphony, I think it's twofold. One, we want to be able to kind of take the technologies we've built to the broader market, right? We've talked about the network technologies and all the things we've done. We've now packaged that into a portfolio that we're taking worldwide. Two, then on the revenue generation side of things, in terms of the platform play, it's whether it's our point system or membership, those tenants that we talked about, the data monetization, we're packaging those and to be able to kind of enable, right? So to me, it's twofold. One, the network and the network transformation. Two, the top line and the revenue generation. So we're wanting to kind of bring to the ecosystem both aspects of that, the technology innovation as well as kind of how we really package our platform that we've talked about, and really be able to kind of bring that to the ecosystem, have conversations with the operators in terms of what their customer promise looks like, how we can bring our platform play to really kind of enable them along the same journey that we've been on, right? So to me, as we look ahead in terms of what's exciting for me, it's really bringing that, having those conversations and really starting to enable operators along this journey.
Absolutely. And that sounds very fascinating because you have to I guess also ask questions to yourself. What is that we did that worked? And what is that maybe worked less as well? Or what is that can be, how can we extrapolate it to a different context, a different market? So you're going to learn a lot just by doing, it's sort of like an introspective work. Let's figure out what we did, who we are in a way after we've done it. So, okay, that's excellent. Well, Udai, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. I'm sure it's a lot of, how should I say, learning point, but also thinking point for everybody in the audience. It was great talking to you. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me, Monica. It's been an absolute blast.
Same here, and I hope you found it this conversation as useful and interesting and inspiring as I did. And thanks for listening in. And more on this on the Sense of Healy website at www.senseofhealy.com. Thank you so much.